Hello, everyone. Welcome to our paper on the making of transnational distinction, an embodied cultural capital perspective on Chinese women students' mobility. We'd like to introduce ourselves first.
Hello everyone, I'm Dr. Siqi Zhang. I'm from Morehouse School of Education and Sport, University of Edinburgh. I'm very happy to be here to present our paper today.
And I'm Dr. Cora Lingling Xu. I'm an assistant professor at the School of Education in Durham University in the UK. I'm also founder and director of Network for Research into Chinese Education Mobilities. And you can follow our Twitter accounts as you can see on the slide. It is indeed our great pleasure to discuss this paper with you, and more specifically, today we will first of all discuss our rationale for researching Chinese women international students. We'll then move on to discuss our conceptualizations using primarily Bourdieu's notions of capital, field, and distinction. But in particular, we will discuss gender as an embodied form of cultural capital, and we will in particular discuss field-specific distinction as appropriate to our empirical data. We'll then briefly discuss the study that we carried out, and we'll then delve into the findings and discuss our contributions. Now, why did we research Chinese women international students? There are a few background sort of rationale for the conduct of this research. First of all, as we knew, the one-child policy that was implemented in China for about 30 odd years since the 1970s, 1980s, has created, this kind of Chinese middle-class young women, especially from urban backgrounds, who have been able to receive their families' concentrated investment in terms of their education. And therefore, we saw a drastic rise in terms of their transnational education pursuits, especially for the urban Chinese middle young women. And as of 2015, for instance, we realized that there were more than 60% of the international Chinese students in Britain who were actually female, which meant that they were the number of female Chinese international students in the UK was larger than their male counterparts. Now, this kind of background also coexisted with very harsh gendered expectations in China's own labor market. And this has been evidenced in the fascinating works of Kayernes and Martin, for instance. And at the same time, the broader background was that there has been this Western degree inflation phenomenon in China, where merely getting a Western degree does not mean that you will necessarily be able to get a good job. And these kind of backgrounds started to challenge the assumed distinction in transnational student mobility, which has been evidenced in my previous studies. And the third rationale is that existing research has focused very much on transnational students' institutionalized forms of social and cultural capital, but very little attention or relatively less attention has been paid to the less visible embodied cultural capital, which manifests, according to Bourdieu himself, through a set of acquired socialized bodies, tastes, and mental dispositions. And this is precisely an area that our paper seeks to make contribution to. And as such, in view of the above rationales, we have decided to ask these two research questions in this paper. The first one is, how does transnational student mobility from China to the UK still bestow these women students distinction against the backdrop of Western degree inflation in China's labor market? And the second one is, when Chinese women students claim distinction from gaining a UK degree, what is the significance of such transnational student flows that result from such a search for distinction? And in order to do that, we have drawn heavily on Bourdieu's notions of distinction, of field, and of capital. And more specifically, we argued that the gender aspect, the gender dimension of distinction has been overlooked in existing literature, and we would like to make contribution in this area. And we specifically conceptualize this distinction markers as the disposition of mind and global cultural tastes as two very prominent kinds of embodied cultural capital exhibited by our women Chinese international students in the UK. And as such, we unify as a global identity, and these act as their distinction markers. In this paper, we specifically talk about their transnational distinction, especially their perceived transnational distinction. And here we use this term, transnational distinction, to identify how these female Chinese students become distinctive regarding their socialized bodies, tastes, and mental dispositions when compared with peers in different specific fields, for instance, in the field back in China or in other overseas studies destinations such as the US. And you will see some concrete examples in our findings. The second main concept that we draw upon was Bourdieu's notion of field. And in this paper, we conceptualized two fields, including the first one, the very broad, the Chinese cultural field, which is a large field where these Chinese women students' privileged social status and resources were positively recognized and legitimated. And the second field that we conceptualized is a large transnational higher education field with a high degree of autonomy as it generates its own values and behavioral imperatives. And this field encompasses the students' experiences both within the university campus and off the university campus. And it encompasses their notable positive exposure to different cultural, gender norms, values during mobility inside and outside the UK higher education system. Now, and in combining distinction and fields, in particular, and appropriate to our empirical data, we focus on what we call the field-specific distinction, which means the distinction that is achieved depending on the features of specific fields that these students are embedded in. And later in our finding section, we will showcase what we mean by field-specific distinction. And of course, a very important concept that we also drew upon was capital, especially as I mentioned earlier when I discussed the research gaps, the embodied aspect of cultural capital, which is manifested through the gendered aspect of the gendered dispositions, of these Chinese women students as an important kind of cultural capital. Right. So this study was conducted at the British University, and we adopted participant observations and informal chats in many social activities, both on and off campus, between November 2015 and November 2016. We also conducted semi-structured interviews with 25 participants. And among the interviewed participants, 5 of them were pursuing their undergraduate degrees, 11 were studying for their taught master's degrees, and the other 9 were pursuing their PhD studies. And most of the women students were from middle-class family backgrounds, and both outside the system, meaning 体制内, or inside the system, 体制外. And this we drew upon Lu's work, 2002 work. Right, now Siqi is going to discuss our key findings and our key contributions.
Okay, thanks Cora for introducing our research rationale, conceptual framework, and our methods. I will continue to present the findings of our paper. Generally, we divided our findings into 3 themes to answer the research questions. The first theme in our finding is being Chinese migrants. Peer comparison acts as negotiated remedy for regaining social recognition. We find that when participants entering a new transnational higher education field, most of them expressed a strong disappointment and even depression when their middle-class social status was overridden by their social status as racialized migrants. This kind of unequal class, race, and ethnic tension brought along by their transnational education mobility was most keenly experienced through the social exclusion exerted from the local society in the UK. For example, facing this kind of situation in one of the participant Linley's case, she mentioned that I find that comparing with peers in China gives me a stronger sense of recognition and acceptance. Okay, Cora, can I move to the next page? Okay, thank you, Cora. In this way, for Lin Li, selecting peers back home as a reference group became a negotiated remedy for regaining social recognition for these racially alienated Chinese women students. So this kind of strategy finds renaissance with Scottish students in Tyndall Alto study who were reported to achieve distinction through chastising their immobile or locally mobile peers back home. And when we compare, and when the participants compare with their peers back China in this case, also constitute one of the multi-stranded connection with their places of origin, as Kelly and Lewis argued, and also play a significant role in influencing their sense of self. Through referring to peers in China, our participants thus consciously position themselves back to the Chinese cultural field. Okay, the second theme of our finding is perceived transnational distinction as offering a superior global identity. So one important acquisition we find is the new embodied gender disposition of mind. Most respondents in our research believe that distinction can be achieved through accumulating embodied cultural capital, namely the absorption of the gendered Western style of practice. For instance, in one of the respondents, Jennifer's case, Jennifer assumed her exposure to and understanding of the wider world, especially her global awareness and her changes to be open to different patterns of women's life. These kind of changes became a crucial signifier of her distinction. Another example is respondent Coco's case. In our participant observation, Coco, who is a master student, went to job interviews. She would wear makeup because, in her opinion, managing a good appearance might offer her more job opportunities. She believed that if the abilities of her competitors were the same as hers, her good look would definitely help her to get an offer in both job markets in China and UK. In this case, it shows our respondents' agency when negotiating gender norms and femininity, and Coco's engagement in femininity, affirming practices like applying makeup for the purpose of better self-development means that she consciously and selectively complied with cultural norms of femininity and made use of such norms to achieve her desired goals. Okay. From Jennifer and Coco's cases, during the whole process of transnational mobility, respondents have obviously absorbed new gender disposition, which also served as a form of gender distinction. It also seems to these participants that their benefits of the broadening of horizon can be seen as the key to the acquisition of global competency, as Victoria and Cohen suggested. So in this way, respondents' new gendered mental disposition served as valuable transnational cultural resources, which are the distinctive asset for forming their global identity and gender identity. Okay, the other acquisition in our finding is embodied global cultural taste. For example, in the case of respondents, Jiahui's impression of local women's clothing style was primarily linked with what she termed as British style. As a Chinese middle-class woman, Jiahui perceived that performing locally accepted middle-class British made her feel more recognized in this transnational higher education field. Jiahui automatically identified all local people as wearing British-style clothing. However, what she considered as British style clothing may only reflect the clothing preference of a fraction of the British middle class. The fact that she automatically equated such a clothing style to the local people again underlines her partial recognition of the class differences in clothing preferences in British society. Besides, most of the participants embodied increasing global cultural taste through frequenting exhibitions, museums, and galleries in their spare time. For example, we can see that respondent's Feifei's case, she shared to us, I feel proud to share with curious friends at home my increasing knowledge about British or Western societies. But it is strange that when facing the local people, such feelings disappear. Maybe because they are here, they can also attend these kind of events. From this case, we can see that Feifei's transnational cultural exposure legitimated her perceived superior transnational distinctive status in Chinese cultural field. However, believing that the local people can also achieve such distinction just because they are physically in the UK, again, demonstrate her oblivion to the exclusive nature of such cultural events to a certain fraction of the British society. Feifei also enjoyed a range of popular mass musicals and American jazz music other than classical music. And we find that Jia Hui and Feifei's interpretation of British local middle class or embodied high taste was strongly restricted to their perspective because of the mixture of their middle class taste and their taste for popular mass culture. What remained constant was the exclusivity of such assortment of cultural events, which were made available to them through their transnational education mobility, thanks to their middle class cultural taste and economic capital. Therefore, in this paper, we argue that in distinguishing themselves through such a set of acquired and displayed global cultural taste, these Chinese women students underlined the central importance of their middle class privilege that enabled them to savor a global culture feast. So this is one of our arguments in this section. Okay, the final theme in our finding chapter is future career orientation and destination, tacit transnational rule cognized as distinction. In this theme, we find that some participants have set clear boundaries in what they can do and what they cannot do in a specific field. This can be shown from how they deal with their new cultural encounters, such as gender disposition in this new transnational field. For example, in Li Yu's case, she strongly recognized that her absorption of the new gendered disposition of mind was restricted when taking her final destination after study into consideration. She supposed that some of her new disposition works only in UK's context, but might not work in China's cultural context when she returned to China. And apart from that, their transnational ties with families also influence respondents dealing with gendered, this kind of newly embodied gender disposition. In Monica's case, she mentioned that I contacted my family every day. As the only daughter, I need to contact them for enough metro emotional care. So I always use Chinese media to get information. I just don't want to be disconnected. But the gender norms in Monica's case can still influence Monica through their use of media within transnational ties. Okay. Um, so, um, generally, in terms of job orientation, since most participants were also prepared to come back to China for job hunting, they have kind of identified peers in China as their potential competitors in the job market. That's another reason why they like to compare with peers in China, as Cora mentioned at the very beginning in theoretical framework. And some participants in this study believe that they had already constructed their distinction over these peers back in China and over the peers who were studied in US through constructing their transnational distinction, especially through embodied newly global cultural taste. Okay, so now we're going to summarize the contribution of our research. First, building on Tyndall Altho's work on the complex nature of distinction, we theorize distinction achieved through transnational education mobility as both field-specific and as manifested through cognizance of transnational field-specific rules. Second, the adoption of an embodied cultural capital perspective allowed us to investigate closely how newly acquired gender disposition of mind, cultural taste, and global identity contributed to the construction of distinction. Our third contribution relates closely to the first two through identifying how various strategic or less strategic referencing peer groups were selected for comparison for these women students to achieve a distinctive status. Overall, this article facilitates an understanding of transnational distinction in a theoretically informed manner as supported by rich empirical details. Okay, that is all about our presentation. If you would like to see more detail, you can get access to our paper through the link here in the reference. And finally, here are the Twitter accounts of me, Cora, and Network for Research into China Education Mobility. Welcome you to follow us. Thank you very much for your listening.